So once again, good morning. Welcome to our adult Sunday school class. As we're going through the Bible, we are at the tail end of the age of the patriarchs. And we are with the last of the patriarchs, Job. So we left off in Job chapter 41. Like to find your way there. Let's go ahead and share the screen. So the majority of the book of Job, pretty much all but the last verse or so, take place, in my estimation, shortly after the death of Joseph, 1591 BC. So I put it about 1588 BC. So at this time, over on this side of the globe in China, during our Middle Bronze Age, 2A, China is being ruled by Emperor Taigeng of their Shang dynasty, their second dynasty. And then we've got over this way here, we have in Egypt, right over here, we have Pharaoh Suaj-Kari of their 13th dynasty during their second intermediate period, after the high point of the Middle Kingdom with Joseph's pharaohs, and before the high point yet to come of the New Kingdom with Ramses and the time of Solomon and all of that. So that's this guy. Over here, in Mesopotamia, Sumer, Shinar, all of that, we have in Assyria, King Urisim II, in the northern part. Down towards the south, we have in Isin, King Damikilishu, who's their last king. Further south in Larsa, we have King Rimsin, who's their last king. Back up in the center here, we have in Babylon, King Apel-Sin, whom I have misspoken about earlier. I've been saying he's the father of Hammurabi. He's actually the grandfather of Hammurabi. It'll be his son who'll be the father of Hammurabi. But that's all to come. Over here in Byblos, in Phoenicia, we've got King Yakin-El. So putting this 1588 BC, zoom in here, that would make Levi 117 years old right now. And in the line of Christ, the descendants of Judah, Perez would be about 86, Hezron about 73, and his son Ram about 15. So Job's in the land of Uz, which is right over here on the opposite side of Mount Sinai from Midian, and the land of Esau's up here. So that's kind of the area we're talking about. So with that, let me go grab something here. All righty. So we ended in Job chapter 41, where after this whole book of conversation between Job and his friends, Lord makes his presence known and says, okay, Job, pull up your pants, stand up like a man, let's have a conversation. And basically the conversation is a reminder of an answer to the question, just how big a God is God? God starts with creation, with light, with the outer space and the constellations. And he talks about bringing it down to the animal kingdom, even the dinosaurs and the things we looked at last week. And so all these amazing things that we saw in Job 41, bringing it down to Leviathan here, I thought about this, and it's been a while since I brought some of these things out. It's been a couple of years since we've been in, talked about creation, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, and all those things. So I thought I would take this opportunity to kind of keep everything connected. While we've been zeroed in on Job, let's kind of zoom out and see his place in the grand scheme of things. So, keeping some of these things in mind, I came across this that I thought I'd share. I'm actually reading a book on, just finished a book on Ronald Reagan and his faith, and that applying into his different things that he did. Well, in that book by Paul Kanger, there was a story that was shared about, there's this thing called apologetics where we explain our faith or we justify our faith. And so he gives us example of apologetics in this book. And the example is from an astronomer named Johann Kepler, very famous astronomer, great discoveries, Christian, like many scientists who see science as the beautiful exploration of the detail of what God did. So here's the quick story here, and we'll tie this into creation and all this as God is reminding Job of these things. So Kepler frequently argued with an atheist colleague. And one day he chose a creative apologetic or explanation to convince his friend that there was a creator. Kepler constructed an elaborate, wondrous working model of the solar system, equipped with a sun encircled by rotating planets, as well as moons moving around planets. When his unbelieving friend saw the model, he was amazed and asked who made it. Nobody, Kepler said. It just happened. A strong wind must have come in one afternoon, Kepler speculated fantastically, and blown around a bunch of laboratory debris and dust and other particles from outside. Somehow, this elaborate model is the result. When his friend asked if Kepler expected him to believe such nonsense, the astronomer said, "Of course not." And yet, Kepler reprimanded his friend, "You're willing to believe that the actual solar system, with its unspeakable complexities, simply created itself. Now that is ridiculous." So I thought that was a kind of a fun story to share, how basically, to sum it up, the astronomer who had an atheist friend, as we were looking at the end of Job 41, going into 42 and wrapping up the book, talking about creation and all these things, Christian astronomer Kepler made up this model. The atheist friend walked in and said, "Wow, who did this?" And he says, "Nobody, just all this dust that was lying around just came together and poof, there it is." And he says, "Well, that's silly." He's like, "But what you're believing about the whole real deal, that's so much more complex than this model. If this is silly, how much sillier is it to believe that?" So I appreciate that example. The basic idea, if there's a design, there's a designer. And things are just so complex. In fact, I'll give you another example. This one actually comes from a stand-up comic. A stand-up comic, he said this once. And I'm just going to quote him. This is real short. So consider this. He says this: "Some people think God created the universe. Some people think nothing created the universe. Which is the funniest guess?" And the nothing people make fun of the God people. They say God doesn't exist. I'm like, okay, maybe. But you know what definitely doesn't exist? Nothing. So this stand-up comic is explaining this thing here about creation as we're looking at Job 41 into Job 42, as God is reminding Job of his majesty in creation. So again, some people think God created the universe. He says some people think nothing created the universe. Which is the funniest guess? The nothing people make fun of the God people, saying God doesn't exist. Maybe. But what definitely doesn't exist is nothing. That's the defining characteristic of nothing. It's that it doesn't exist. So what are we talking about? Either, and this is a stand-up comic saying this, either you think it's God, something you can't see, touch, taste, photograph, and science can't prove, or you think it's nothing, something you can't see, taste, touch, photograph, and science can't prove. But, he says, I think we can all agree, if you're nothing, sometimes spontaneously erupts into everything, that's a pretty magical blankety blank nothing, you guys.
George Carlin?
Yeah, no.
Oh.
You'd think, once I got to the blankety blanks, they thought George Carlin, yeah. Sharp guy, though. Then it says, and ask the nothing people, what happens when you die? They'll tell you nothing. You go into nothing. I'm like, you mean you merge back with your creator? If you're created by nothing and you die, you go to nothing. So even you say when you die, you're going back to what created you, which was in your case, nothing. That's heaven. So just a kind of different look at some things there on perspective. And we know that we as Christians, as believers in God, creator of everything, that we sometimes get mocked for our belief. And we get treated like we're being superstitious or childish, when really, if we can just stop and have a common sense conversation, which is sillier and which is more based on the evidence around us, which is Paul's point in Romans chapter 1, the evidence for the creator is all around. And so there we go. So I want to encourage us not to, I mean, we know what we are convicted of is right and true, clearly, and that's not going to change, and no one's going to change that. But I don't want you to feel disheartened or discouraged if conversations come up or you come across things where what you believe and know to be true is being mocked. When we can kind of turn it around and see, let's kind of take a look at what the alternative is, and is that really any better, or does that really explain the evidence that we see tremendously pointing to a majestic creator for the clay?
You spoke of apologetic.
Yeah.
Now, other than what you just mentioned, within the religion realm, the first time I heard of that word was with Barack Obama. The apologetic. Is that, am I, going around the earth apologizing for things we've done or whatever?
Yeah. There's definitely a relation in the words apology, apologetics, which is why I initially kind of ruffle at describing Christianity using the phrase apologetics. We're not apologizing for anything. We're happy and proud and grateful for what we proclaim. But there's the same concept there, comes from the Greek apo, the root word of apostasy and Apollo, which is we're going out. And so, the president, as you're referring to, he went on what was nicknamed an apology tour, basically apologizing to the world for how bad America is. Apologetics is going out and explaining the faith and why we believe what we believe in the faith. Basically following the example that Peter gives, be ready to give an answer of the hope that is in you, kind of thing. So does that kind of help with the relation between those very similar sounding words? Yeah. So it's like I said, it's been a couple of years since we've gone through creation, the flood, and Tower of Babel and all that, and then to the patriarchs where we are now. So I thought if y'all would indulge me, I would take some time and share some things. 2 clips, one we haven't seen, one I've shared, but it's been a while. First one's just over 10 minutes, second one's just under, so they'll come together and they'll fit. Basically, as we were talking last week about genetics, about diversity, and how it all worked. So we'll start with Ken Ham from Answers in Genesis, and we'll follow it up with Todd Wood from the film Is Genesis History, talking about these things we've been looking at. So he's going to take off from here, talking about the fossil record and how we see different, he's talking about the examples of how we see variety in dogs, but they might be the same kind, even though they look kind of different. But we have a problem in the fossil record because we can't really see what's happening. It's kind of a snapshot, and he'll joke about that. But how do we know basically how many animals were on the ark? Is basically we can look back and see, well, these later came from some source animals. He didn't have to have all the different varieties. He just had to have the source animals that could, through the genes that they have, create everything else. So check this out, and I'm going to actually pause it at one point and explain some things. But here is Ken Ham on these things we ended up our conversation with last week.
But you imagine if you found a Chihuahua and a Great Dane in the fossil record, you'd be hard pressed if you didn't see them alive to think that they were the same kind, right? Well, there are creatures in the fossil record. The problem is you can't see them interbreed because they're dead. Just wonder, most of you didn't get that, but fossils are dead. They're not alive. They can't breed. You understand that, right? Like Man, I can't start at a different level here for this one. Okay, so we allow a number of different kinds when there's probably far fewer kinds. That's why we think it's less than 1,000. So when you look at our classification system, we have the dog kind, Canidae, and that's the family level, different genera, different species, but we would say there's one kind of dog. And the same with cats. Felidae, we'd say that's the family, so that's probably the kind. So that means you'd only need 2 of the dog family and 2 of the cat family on the ark. So there are 34 different species of dogs. You've got all these different species of dogs. And here's what the secular world says: based on genetic, morphological, and behavioral data, it's clear that the domestic dog originates from the wolf. Now, it's interesting that the wolf and the domestic dog are the same species, but they say something like this actually over time gave rise to these, including these, which is sort of hard to understand, right? And see, when you see changes like this, evolutionists use these sort of changes as, oh, it's part of evolution. But actually, when you see these changes, that's the opposite of evolution. When you look at what's happening with the dog kind, and you get different species and then your domestic species there, what's happening overall is a loss of information till you get to the stage where you don't have a lot of information left. I mean, a poodle is sort of the end of the line in dogs, okay? If it lost any more information, it'd be gone. I mean, that's the end. Right? Now, we don't know how many dogs God made originally. Let's say he made 2 dogs and they got married, had kids, and they got married, had kids, and they got married, had kids. And then we end up with a typical homeschool family of dogs. Okay, so now, how do we get the different species, all right? How do we get those? Well, in genetics, we have a convention: big A, big B, big C, dominant genes, little a, little b, little c, recessive genes. Remember?
I'm going to pause here. So there's the dad and the mom, and AA, let's say blue hair, brown hair, or blue eyes, brown eyes, blue eyes, brown eyes, big nose, little nose, big nose, little nose, and whatever for CDEO, tall, short, tall, short. So those are the genes. So those are all the different genes that are available from mom and dad. Does that make sense to everyone? Yes? No?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Cool.
For this, and it's much more complex than this, but this is the basic principle. So here's a male and female dog, and they have a mixture of genes. And so sexual reproduction, one set of genes to the parent, each parent, and you get a combination. Notice that combination there is different to the parents, so it's going to look different to the parents. It's actually got less information than the parents, no longer has little a's, little b's, or little c's. So it's actually lost genetic diversity.
So this is a very important. So with the parents, you got big A, big B, little b, big C, little c. So if one combination of a kid comes out with all big A's and big B's and big C's from the parents, that's one possibility how a kid could come out. But what that kid doesn't have is they lost the little a, little b, and little c. That stayed with the parents. It didn't come down to the kid.
That's dominant and
Yep, you've got it.
recessive genes.
Dominant and recessive traits.
But isn't the A, the small, or say it's still there,
Mhm.
even though the 2 dominant, but there can't be no
Yeah.
more than just 2.
What you're talking about is sometimes you can be a carrier of a gene that's not active, just like some things kind of seem to skip generations sometimes. Sometimes having twins is something that's a family trait and skips generations. What we're saying here is what you think that, okay, I'm 50% of my mom and I'm 50% of my dad. Yeah, making my 100%. And then if my parents had another child, they would also be 50% would be from mom, 50% from dad. But it's not everything from mom is my 50% and everything from dad is my other 50%. It's a randomizer almost of what we get from our parents. So I do not have everything that was in my mom's DNA. I do not have everything that was in my dad's DNA. My DNA only exists from part of the information that was in both of them. I got some things from mom's DNA, some things from dad's DNA, but my mix is a unique mix that has any information I have, I only got from them, but I did not get all the information they have. Does that make sense?
All right, but it's going to be a dog. If those 2 are dogs, it's going to be a dog. right? You look different to your parents because you're a unique combination of information. And by the way, that unique combination is right there at fertilization, which means it's not a part of the mother's body. It's a unique combination. So it's an individual made in God's image, which means abortion is killing a human being. Remember that. So these are the other combinations that you can get. I like to use this one here to represent our purebred, what we call purebred dogs, like poodles, okay? Because how do we get purebred dogs? When we say pure, they're not pure in the sense of perfect, the opposite of that. Pure in the sense of we've eliminated genetic variability. It's called artificial selection. We say, oh, here's a dog with a short nose, a dog with a short nose, let's breed them together and eliminate all the genes for long noses. You get the idea? By the way, because we do that, what happens is you're concentrating the mutations that have added up over time because of sin. So if you have one of those purebred dogs, you know, Maltese or Bichon or Poodle or Chihuahua, you know it costs you millions of dollars to keep them alive, right? This breed has eye problems. This one has arthritis problems. This one has breathing problems. Isn't that right? I mean, you look at the bulldog, those poor things have got their jaws stuck up into their face, their nose stuck into their head, and they can hardly breathe. And we say, what a beautiful little dog. So, see, here's a problem we've got, though. I want you to think about this. In a lot of our Sunday school literature and children's books, you know what it says to our kids? Look at these beautiful animals God made. You know, look at the poodle. God made the poodle. Think about it. When God made everything, he said it was very good. You can't call a poodle very good. Do you know the correct definition of a poodle, a chihuahua, a bulldog? You know the correct definition of them? Sin-cursed, degenerate, mutated copies of the original dog that God made. That's what they are. So when you look at your little dog, you say, come here, little degenerate mutant, come here. Because that's what they really are, okay? Now, you think about it, if you've got one of them, you know that you've got to pay a lot of money to keep them alive. That's what keeps the vets in business. If you've got one of those mongrel dogs and it's a mixture of everything in the neighborhood, you can run over them with a truck and they'll get up and wave and off they go. So now, and by the way, here's the problem. We tell kids, look at these animals God made. Then they go to public school, which the majority of them do. And they're told, do you realize God didn't make them because they have changed? And these species have come into existence over time, and your dogs were bred in the last few hundred years, which means God didn't make them, and evolution's true, and then they get indoctrinated and brainwashed. See, that's why we've got to make sure we teach them correctly. So God didn't make the poodle directly, he made the original dog. You get the idea? We've got to understand this. We don't teach those to our kids in our churches and homes, and unfortunately they get led astray. You see, I'm always looking to teach things from a biblical worldview perspective. I had a little elderly lady once come to me and she said, well, is my poodle going to be in heaven with me? Well, you know, I try to be gracious and gentle and sensitive, but I just said, well, ma'am, there's no sin in heaven. So that solved that problem, okay? So now, let's go on here. I want you to look at this. So, if this is a poodle, if you breed a poodle with a poodle, all you're going to get is what? A poodle, okay? But could you breed poodles and get back the original dogs? No, because you don't have the genetic diversity. But could you take the original dogs and again get poodles? The answer is what? Yes, you got that potential. Now, to help us understand, I want you to understand the genetic diversity that God has already put in creatures. The number of atoms in the universe is said to be 10 to the 80th power. That's a lot of atoms. If you took one man and one woman from this audience, how many children could you potentially have without having two with the same combination of information? It's that number. That number is so big you can't even think about it. People, do you realize something? DNA that builds a dog or a cat or a human is filled with information, and it has a language system that reads the information. Matter has never produced a language system by itself and can't. Matter has never been shown to produce one bit of information. There are zillions of bits of information in living systems. Evolution is ridiculous. It can't happen. God made kinds with incredible genetic diversity. And so 2 of each kind gets on the ark, 7 of some, 7 pairs of some. 2 dogs on the ark, they come off the ark, they increase in number, but they're not going to stay together. As they split up from each other and move away from each other, different combinations of genes will survive in different areas depending on the conditions. It's called natural selection. It's like artificial selection, except it's because of the environment that the selection occurs, not because we choose which one breeds with which. You get the idea? Help us understand. 2 dogs get off Noah's Ark. S is short hair, L for long hair, S and L give medium hair in dogs, and they have an offspring. Oh, look, here's what they do in the schools. It's got something new, short hair, that's evolution. It's got something new. Do you know what's new? The combination of information. It's actually got less information than the parents. And then you get this one, and then you get this one. Oh, it's got something new, long hair. It's like Darwin's finches. Oh, look, Darwin's finches, bigger beaks and smaller beaks. That's evolution. No, it's just different combinations of the genetic diversity that was already there to give those features. And actually, it's got less information than the parents, which is the opposite of evolution. For evolution, you want new information that never existed, adding into the genes to produce something that never was there before. That's not what you see. And so over time, what happens? Those that go towards a cold climate, in a cold climate, those with short hair and medium hair get cold and they die. And now you're left with dogs with just L genes, which means on their own, they're only going to produce long-haired dogs. You could get a different species of dog, right? Over time, those that go towards a hot climate, those with long hair and medium hair overheat and they die. And now you're left with dogs with only has S genes. So what's new? Natural selection involves new combinations of already existing information, the genetic diversity that was already there, a loss of information, conserving the information that was there, but there's no brand new information. That's the opposite of evolution. So natural selection is really a downhill process, the opposite of evolution. And so over time, what happens? You end up having these animals that adapt in that sense. That's what they call adaptation, natural selection, resulting in different species, but it's not evolution. Think about this for a moment. There are 338 breeds of dogs after several hundred years. What can natural processes do in a few thousand years in the wild, acting on created genetic diversity? See, we know much can happen in a short period of time because the genetic diversity already exists. This is the key. Evolutionists say the genetic diversity has to be evolved, has to come about by natural processes. What we're saying, no, that never happens. The genetic diversity is already there, which is why speciation happens quickly. See, if you look at a Great Dane and a Yorkshire Terrier, they look very, very different. Did you know that Darwin actually said in England, look at the breeds of dogs, look at the difference there. So given enough time in the environment by natural processes, you can get these different species a part of evolution. Do you realize the wolf and the coyote are considered to be different species? Look how similar they look. Look at the difference here. And these are the one species. If you can get this.
I'm going to stop there real quick what he just said. The wolf and the coyote are different species, and look how much they look alike. These two are the same species, and look how different they look. So Darwin's saying eventually these that look so different will evolve into these that look the same. Yeah. Yeah, please. Sure, go right ahead.
Difference in dogs, you can breed those differences in a few hundred years. Then what Darwin was saying, because you can do that in a few hundred years, over hundreds of thousands of years, look what can happen in the wild, which is nonsense. It means here that difference it doesn't even look that great. It can happen quickly. And the point is you can get massive speciation because of the genetic diversity. Think the kinds on the ark have this massive genetic diversity, which in the post-flood world, as they move away from each other, you can get these different species. You wouldn't expect to see as much speciation today simply because that genetic diversity in a lot of instances has been diluted. And so over time, to help us understand, here's a wolf, a jar of jelly beans representing genetic diversity. And over time, you can get less and less genetic diversity till you get to the stage there's just not a lot left at all. By the way, just to go on the record, I hate cats. So you can see that. So Noah needed far fewer animals on the ark than we think he needed. Far fewer. And as we said, probably 1,000 kinds. Most animals are pretty small. There was tons of room on the ark, as you'll see when you visit the ark. Now, what I want you to do is to apply this to the humankind.
And that's where we'll leave this one. So everything we just saw with the animals, number one, did that make sense?
Yeah.
So number two, he says, now apply that to the humans. Think the separation at the Tower of Babel. And as we take our different genes into different areas, and they're just limited to the area is limited to whatever genes come to it. So if only a certain group comes to it, they only have the genes that they bring with them. And so that's why in different areas, we see people with different features. So that's how that comes about.
Like the United States has different.
Yeah, because so many people, the beautiful thing about the United States being the true melting pot is that we have people from such diverse backgrounds coming together. America is a great place for diversity and for, as he said, when you're isolated, you have, if you are marrying and reproducing with someone who's got similar genes, your kids are going to be similar. So they're going to have the good that you have, but they're also going to have the bad that you have because we're sin infected and we have issues. Where, which is why, as one example, in people groups that have darker skin in their melanin tone, in African societies and whatnot, and others, one of the traits is that they have more tendency towards sickle cell anemia. And so just like he mentioned in different dog breeds, there are different things, same thing with different varieties of human. And so the more we meld with others who have different genes, the more diverse we are in our coming together, the more we get the benefit. Okay, my genes have this strength and this weakness. Wife's genes have that strength and that weakness. Put them together, a child would have the benefit of those offsetting each other. You know, my strengths could offset her weaknesses and vice versa. So that's the kind of thought there. We'll wrap up with a field trip to the zoo. And this is a clip from his Genesis history, Dr. Todd Wood, bringing this diversity we're seeing from the animals into the diversity we see in humans that are still humans, as we were addressing Brother Clay's question at the end of class last week about the different things you hear in the line of evolution, what's different, what is really just different humans versus what's not human. So we'll wind down with that here.
Todd Wood and I walked through the zoo. We saw incredible beauty and amazing design wherever we looked. I noticed the great diversity between some animals, as well as the remarkable similarity of others. As a biologist, what do you see when you see all of these creatures?
Yeah, when I look at this, these lions specifically, I'm seeing cats myself, and all the other cats they have here at the zoo, they all have this underlying catness to them that's really apparent. It's really apparent when they start playing, right? You're seeing them playing with some sort of ball or something, and they're
just like a cat.
They look like a cat. You know, scientists would put that into a family called Felidae. And I would understand the felids to be representatives of a single created kind. So the continuity, the similarity there is so significant that I'd say, yeah, these guys have all descended from a single pair of critters that was on the ark, and that eventually generated all the different sorts of cats that we have today.
So rather than just a random accident, it appears as if all of these different species are coming from a really elaborate design.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just a design like God, you know, designed and created the lion. It's God created something that could make a lion. So it's more like, you know, a multi-tool or a Swiss Army knife where you got all these pieces that you can just pop out whenever you need them, but it's all just one thing.
Just give me some other examples of created kinds.
Yeah, so got the grizzlies and the polar bear. Those are all members of the bear kind. Got ducks, swans, geese. The thing about the dog kind is really interesting. So you take just this wolf-like creature and we can breed in only a few hundred years, many different breeds.
Well, Todd, that's kind of fascinating now to think about what God was doing when he was bringing two of every kind. What do you think was going on there?
Oh, yeah, I mean, he doesn't have to bring every little variety onto the ark. So when you actually do the calculations and, okay, so we don't know exactly how many created kinds there were on the ark, but maybe a couple thousands. And they're small. Most animals are quite small. So you have room to spare, literally room to spare. And all of that diversity that we have today is built into those two of every kind.
Well, Todd, we're looking at the zebras and they're all unique. And yet all of these creatures are just so much complexity and diversity. How does the standard story, the conventional paradigm, explain all of that?
Well, they would use evolution, right? So millions of years, random variations, all things that are alive now, that cactus, that zebra, the grass here, it's all related. We all go back to a common ancestor that lived billions of years ago. And through the process of mutation and genetic variation and natural selection, that's where we get the stuff that we have today.
So natural selection, what is it? Does it have the kind of creative potential that we need for all of this?
Natural selection is basically all about killing off things that aren't fit for the environment. So if you're a finch in the Galapagos and you have a really tiny beak and the only food available to you is really big hard seeds, you're going to die. And that's exactly what we observe. And so we can watch over the generations as the beak size and finches change in the Galapagos. But they're still finches, they're still birds. The notion that natural selection can generate all of the diversity we see, that's not been demonstrated. What we find most often with natural selection is that natural selection does a lot of fine tuning. So right over here, we've got these oryxes, right? Beautiful creatures and very, very pale colors. The wild range of the oryx is right on the southern end of the Sahara Desert. And so you can see, yeah, the coloration makes sense. If you get a really dark colored one, that's going to be really easy for predators to find. And so they end up being these really beautiful light colors. And that's an example of where selection would take a variation and turn it into an adaptation.
And that brings us back to the notion that a really exquisite design in the beginning
Oh, I think so. Oh, absolutely.
has provided these creatures with the ability to survive and to change for their benefit.
Absolutely. So the ability to be able to change your coloration like that, to be able to fit an environment, that's got to be built into the system before it starts. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, natural selection and random variation can do amazing things. I mean, it's pretty astonishing the kinds of changes that we can see, but we don't see one kind changing into another. All we see are variations that happen within a created kind. So there's a felid tree, which has all the cats on it. There's the canid tree, which has all the dogs on it. There's the ursid tree, which has all the bears on it. There's the equid tree with all the horses on it. Each individual created kind then has its own individual tree, so that you end up with something like an orchard or a forest.
As a scientist, it seems what you're saying is that the Genesis paradigm answers all of this data better.
Ultimately, I think it does, because it embraces both similarity and difference. Now, as we've already said, there's lots of questions that are still out there, but I'm pretty confident, given what our paradigm can explain, I'm very confident that those answers are going to be found.
After we left the zebras, we made our way to the gorillas. Todd wanted to talk about the question of human evolution. Todd, we see it all the time, a new discovery, new skulls, new skeletons that supposedly solidify this whole link. Yeah, what do you see there?
Absolutely. Well, I got some right here in my bag.
Ooh, a skull.
So this guy is a Neanderthal, very, very low forehead. So we have really tall foreheads. The mid face has been pulled out. But at the same time, well, it looks very human. So that's Neanderthal. You want to hold that one for me? Yeah. Okay. We have others that are very different.
Oh, yeah.
Now, this one is Australopithecus africanus. So you can see really no forehead at all. It just slopes right back. Very, very small brain case. Muzzle sticks way out. So the face is sloped forward. What do you do with this stuff? I mean, there's many more that we could show, many more pictures, many more skulls, and you can see looking at them together, they're really. There's a lot of difference there.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. So all that created kind stuff that we already talked about, I can show again and again and again with multiple studies that I can find a discontinuity between humans and non-humans. So this thing lands on the human side. This Neanderthal here, it's one of us. This thing is not. It is different. But this would be just another one of those varieties of living things that God made in the beginning and that survived the flood aboard the ark.
So when we look at Neanderthal man, we're looking at a human, but it's a human that, just like we find in dogs, we have a lot of variety of dogs.
We got a lot of variety of people. So even looking back here at the gorilla, we can see the obvious differences between us and him, not the least of which is that he's in there and we can go home when we're done.
And so those differences are really huge, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. The image of God entails this idea of being God's representative here on this earth. Part of that then is having dominion and having authority, spiritual quality that we have, that we don't share with animals like that.
It's obvious we're
So pause there. So did that help further with what we were talking about last week? And again, I want to bring this into God's conversation with Job about reminding Job just who God is and the majesty of his creation and all these things that we're talking about. So do those kind of help kind of bring that home?
Yeah, a little question.
Yeah.
When we was talking about natural selection,
Yes.
and even in earlier, it made me think of the dogs, the short hair.
Yeah.
And their long hair. And they both said, well, that one didn't make it, he died.
Yep.
That ended it right there.
Yep.
But when the finches, their beaks, saying as an example, beaks were too small, they ate the big seeds, they died.
Yes.
Then he went on to say that they adapted.
The
So how can a dead bird adapt?
it's not the individual that adapts, it's the species that adapts.
If they die, they're gone.
The individual, not the species.
Well, all the finches that were in that area died.
No.
They all had small beaks.
No,
They only had seed,
no,
but that, okay.
no. There was variety at the time. And so what happens is the trait comes out. Remember the genes that are passed down. And so what happens is those who have small beaks die. Those who have the bigger beaks are the ones that are left to reproduce. And all you end up with are the larger beaks. Just like the dogs with a,
That I didn't catch.
Yeah.
There were other finches.
yeah, exactly.
I'm just going by
Yeah.
what he said about natural selection. And it's like, wait,
Hmm.
how can a dead, and it takes time.
Yeah, not that much time. Not as much time as evolution requires.
Like 100 years or?
Yeah,
less-
even less, yeah. And so, and what we see is change within a species over a short period of time, understandably adapting to the environment. That fits, that makes sense. That information, and this is the key point here, that information is already there within the species. Yeah. And the whole point of evolution is, lo and behold, ta-da, new information showed up out of the blue from nothing. That never happens. There's never new information. There's never a crossing from one kind to another. It is always variation within the species. And so when we think Neanderthal, yeah, they aren't necessarily our ancestors, although a lot of us do have Neanderthal genes in us, believe it or not. They can be just different lines existing at the same time. And just as small beaks, big beaks existing, and then the small beaks dying off, leaving the big beaks. So Neanderthals died off and we're just left with us now. And our genetic differences are very, very small as far as that kind of goes. And so remember, bringing this back to Job, I want to close in Job 42. Let's pick it up in the first verse, Job's response, and we'll close here. After God reminds Job of what he did at creation, talking about light, talking about energy, talking about lightning and thunder, talking about the constellations. After God reminds Job of what he's done with the animal kingdom, There, as we talked last week, there are dinosaurs still in existence at the time of Job, 1588 BC. And so we see here, God makes this presentation, makes this case of Job about how big a God he is. Look at Job's response in chapter 42, verse 1. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no plan is impossible for you. Who is this who conceals advice without knowledge? Therefore, I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I do not know. Please listen, and I will speak. I will ask you, and you instruct me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I retract, I repent, sitting on dust and ashes. We'll pick up with this next week, but basically Job is saying, I get it now. When I didn't understand, I always had faith in you, but I was hurting and wondering why I was hurting. And so I had questions for you, and I wasn't getting immediate answers from you. But now that I'm reminded of how big and majestic you are, how you've taken care of all these things, okay, you're the big guy, I'm the little guy, you've got me covered. I'm gonna not complain anymore. I'm going to continue to trust you the rest of the way now, and I'm going to accept. And so that's the place Job came to after all this, and we'll pick that up with further thoughts next week. But yes, Brother Peter.
Back to the cat.
Yeah.
You know, I was brought up, small, behave the Bible, we look at it, and all pages where it goes to, and then Adam and Eve, but you see the lion there, different animals, birds, and that's what I was, saw.
Yeah.
But so those lions, weren't what we saw, or are they the same lions that what we have in the Bible? Or were they different lions?
Yeah. Basically, what we see described in the Bible, if it still exists today, it's very similar to what existed back then. So lions, since the animals came off the flood in close to 3000 BC, 2953 by my math. So the flood, 2953 BC, they come off the ark. The two Felidae, the two cat mom and dad, they produce all the others, and the other species come out, puma, puma, leopard, and lion. And so the lions that came from those genes that existed then, when the Bible describes lions, they're describing the lions that we know today.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a huge study on the animals of the Bible and which ones identify with animals we know today, which ones like Leviathan and Rahab and these others that are clearly and Behemoth that are clearly describing animals we don't have today.
They had the saber-tooth tigers.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
like,
And the Ice Age and all that lasted for about the one Ice Age that happened, which lasted about 500 years after the ark. After the flood. Yeah. Brother Tim.
Like with the animals, I know a swan tiger we never saw on here. Of course, it's not here anymore. The saber-tooth tiger.
That exactly right. Exactly right. The saber-tooth. Yeah. That came out after the ark, and then it didn't last long since then. And so we don't have it today.
So.
Yeah.
Pretty much, what the animals look like going on the yard were completely different. I mean, it would, we got what we know
Mhm.
as far as cats and dogs and what
Yeah.
they look like, but they could have been similar.
Right.
It could have been multicolored. It
Yes.
could have, not even remotely resembling. Or
What we're used
very
to.
Remotely resembling.
Yeah.
What we have.
That's very possible. And it's also possible that they looked a little more similar to what we're used to, but that information was still within them. While they didn't look like, if you throw a tiger and a leopard and a lion into a mixer, and what comes out is a little mix of, not necessarily, but the information is all there. So the information that could create something that looks 100% lion, something that's 100% leopard, something that's 100% tiger, that information is all there, just a matter of how it comes out later. So the animals on the ark had all the information. How much of that information was manifested in how they looked at that time, we don't know. Or how weird they looked or what combination of that. But the important thing is all the information was within them that could later spread out and produce all these things. And the same thing with humans. Brother Joe.
Where are the dinosaurs?
The dinosaurs were on the ark. We actually had a little clip last week that we showed how the word dinosaur is a recent word in the 1800s. They didn't have that word to describe them before then. So they still existed after the ark, and one of the words used to describe them was dragon. And so we have, just as in Job 41, God describes a fire-breathing animal that was in existence at the time of Job. So Job is over 1,000 years since Noah's flood, and yet there are still fire-breathing animals at the Job's time that God is pointing Job to. Hey, I'm God who made that fire-breathing thing that you're familiar with. So dinosaurs lasted a lot longer than we're taught, a lot longer than we think. The last record of anything dinosaur, of course, they kind of wear and tear over the course of time and got weaker. The last record we have is about 1500 AD, so 500 years ago. And so, yeah, we have records of the patron saint of England, St. George, slaying a dragon. We kind of see the kind of dragon that's described, a dinosaur that's described, and sure enough, there are bones of that dinosaur in that area. And so, yeah, so dinosaurs definitely fit into all of this. And there's nothing about the evidence, there's nothing about what's observed that contradicts God's word, Brother Peter.
Still got that one floating around.
Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot,
I was about to say.
Yeah. all that stuff. So yeah, great stuff. So nature's beautiful and crazy and wild, and God, it has a designer. And so the whole point at the end of Job here is to rejoice and celebrate the creator, who not only had the power, ability, intelligence, and majesty to create all these things and all these things that could come from these things, but he's that intricately involved and aware with us. Just like Jesus said, not one sparrow falls to the ground apart from your Father. Have no fear, you are more valuable than sparrows. And you thank you, Lord, indeed. So that's God's whole point in all of this, is to remind Job of how much God loves Job. And he is there with him and is by his side and seeing him through. And that's where we will pick up next week. So with that, we'll go ahead and stop our share and stop our recording for this morning.